He knelt at the edge of a mass grave, hands bound, eyes open, and in the last seconds of his life, Werner Braune felt something he had denied thousands of others: mercy, in the form of a quick death, because the men he sent to their graves never got that mercy at all. This is the story of the man behind Einsatzkommando 11B, a name that doesn't sound like much until you learn what it did in just 3 days in December 1941. 3 days, 14,300 lives gone, and the man who signed off on it, a doctor of law, educated, composed, the kind of man you'd never suspect until you saw what he was capable of. If you think evil always looks monstrous, wait until you see his face. Before we go further, if dark history like this genuinely fascinates you, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear gets darker with every passing minute. Turn on notifications too, because next week we're uncovering a story even more disturbing than this one. Now, back to the man in the mugshot. Werner Braune wasn't born a killer. He was born in a small German town, studied law, earned his doctorate, and by every measure should have become a quiet bureaucrat. But somewhere between his law books and his ambition, something shifted. By 1931, he'd already joined the Nazi Party. By 1934, the SS. And by 1941, he wasn't practicing law anymore. He was commanding death. But here's what almost nobody talks about: Braune had a wife, Margit, and in the letters he wrote her, some historians say he sounded almost ordinary. A husband complaining about work, a man who came home at night after doing the unthinkable and still expected dinner on the table. How does a man do that? How does he separate husband from executioner in the same breath? That question is exactly what unravels his story. In October 1941, Braune was handed command of Sonderkommando 11B, part of the larger Einsatzgruppe D, one of the Nazi death squads that followed the German army into the Soviet Union. Their mission wasn't combat, it was extermination, and Crimea was about to become his testing ground. The city was Simferopol. The date, December 11th, 1941. What happened over the next 72 hours would later be read aloud in a Nuremberg courtroom, and even hardened prosecutors struggled to keep their composure. Because what Braune ordered wasn't chaotic slaughter, it was organized, efficient, documented in his own unit's reports in cold administrative language, as if murder were just another line item. 14,300 people did not walk home from that operation. And the most chilling part, Braune never once tried to deny it. When asked years later what happened to the people rounded up in those raids, he answered without flinching: they were all shot. No guilt, no hesitation, just a fact stated the way a man might report the weather. So how did a lawyer become one of the most efficient killers of the Holocaust? And what happened in those 3 days in Simferopol that would follow him all the way to the gallows? That's where we go next. Simferopol, December 1941. To understand what happened here, you have to understand what the city looked like just days before. It was alive, markets open, families going about ordinary lives, unaware that a unit of German officers had already drawn up the plans for their extermination. Braune's men didn't storm in with chaos and gunfire in the streets. They did something far more calculated and far more terrifying. They used deception. Notices went up ordering Jewish residents to report for resettlement. Bring your belongings, the orders said. Report to a specific location by a specific time. Simple instructions. Bureaucratic, almost reassuring. That reassurance was the trap. Thousands complied because who wouldn't trust an official order delivered calmly without threats? They believed they were being relocated. They packed bags. They brought photographs, coats, whatever mattered most to them. They were being led to a grave. Over 3 days, December 11th to 13th, Braune's Einsatzkommando 11B, working alongside auxiliary units, carried out one of the most devastating single massacres of the entire Eastern Front campaign. People were marched to the outskirts of the city, to pits already dug in the frozen ground. And then the shooting began. Group after group, hour after hour. The unit's own reports, later used as evidence against Braune at Nuremberg, describe the operation with a bureaucratic coldness that still unsettles historians today. Numbers, locations, timeframes, as if human lives were inventory to be processed. By the time it was over, 14,300 people were dead, almost the entire Jewish population of Simferopol, erased in 72 hours. Now here's something that rarely gets said in documentaries about this era. Many of the men carrying out these orders weren't lifelong fanatics. Some were husbands, fathers, men who, that same evening, might return to modest quarters, write home to their wives, and describe their day in vague, sanitized terms. Braune himself did exactly that. Historians who have studied his personal correspondence note something deeply disturbing: the domestic, almost mundane tone of his letters to Margit, his wife, written during the very period he was overseeing mass murder. No confession, no anguish, just the rhythms of ordinary married life, running parallel to unimaginable horror. It raises the question that still haunts researchers of this period. Was this evil a monster in disguise, or something far more unsettling? An ordinary man, capable of switching off his conscience like a light switch, then switching it back on for dinner. Because that's the real horror of Werner Braune. Not that he was a screaming fanatic, but that he was disturbingly composed. And when the war ended, that composure didn't crack, not even in a courtroom. In 1947, Braune was captured and put on trial in one of the most significant war crimes proceedings in history, a trial that would expose, in exhaustive detail, exactly how organized and deliberate the Einsatzgruppen killings had been. What he said on that witness stand, the words that condemned him in his own voice, is something you need to hear for yourself, because his defense wasn't denial. It was something far colder. Part 3. The Nuremberg Courtroom, 1947. Rows of Allied judges, stacks of captured German documents, records so thorough, so bureaucratically precise, that the Nazis had unintentionally built the case against themselves. Werner Braune sat in the dock alongside 23 other commanders of the Einsatzgruppen. This wasn't a minor proceeding. This was the trial that would become known as the Einsatzgruppen Case, one of the most damning war crimes trials in modern history, because unlike so many wartime atrocities, this one didn't rely on rumor or survivor testimony alone. It relied on the killer's own paperwork. And that's what makes what happened next so chilling. When prosecutors asked Braune directly what had happened to the Jewish men, women, and children rounded up during his operations in Crimea, he didn't hesitate, he didn't deflect. He gave an answer so blunt it silenced the room. They were all shot. 4 words. No qualification. No expression of remorse. Just a plain admission, delivered with the same tone he might use to confirm a delivery had arrived on schedule. Legal historians who have studied the trial transcripts point to this moment again and again, because it captures something more disturbing than outright denial would have. A war criminal who lies is, in a strange way, still acknowledging that what he did was wrong. Braune didn't lie. He simply didn't see the wrongness at all. His defense, when it came, followed the same pattern used by almost every defendant in that courtroom, a strategy that would go down in history under a name we still use today: the Nuremberg defense. I was following orders. Braune argued that as a soldier and an officer, refusing the Führer order would have meant his own destruction, that he had no real choice but to comply. It was the argument used by nearly every man in that trial, and it was about to fail every single one of them, because the tribunal wasn't interested in whether Braune had personally hated what he did. They were interested in what he had actually done, and how thoroughly, how efficiently, how willingly he had done it. On April 8th and 9th, 1948, the verdicts came down. 14 of the 24 defendants were sentenced to death, including Werner Braune. The tribunal's written judgment didn't mince words. It found him guilty on every count, guilty of crimes against humanity, guilty of war crimes, guilty simply for having belonged to the criminal organizations that carried out the Holocaust in the East. But here's where the story takes a turn almost nobody expects. Braune didn't hang the day of his sentencing, or that year, or even the next. He waited for 3 years, held at War Criminals Prison No. 1 in Landsberg am Lech, the very same prison, incidentally, where a young Adolf Hitler had once been imprisoned and written Mein Kampf decades earlier. Braune sat on death row while his case moved through appeal after appeal, review after review. Because in the years right after the war, something politically complicated was happening. Cold War tensions were rising. Some in the West were beginning to argue for clemency toward German officers, hoping to rebuild alliances against the Soviet Union. For a moment, it seemed possible that Braune and others like him might escape the gallows entirely. That possibility ended on January 31st, 1951. General Thomas Handy, the U.S. Army's commander in Europe, made the final call. Clemency denied. The date was set, June 7, 1951. And this is where we return to where we started. The pit, the ropes. The men led out one by one in the dark hours after midnight. Braune was one of the last of the condemned Einsatzgruppen commanders to walk to the gallows that night, following men like Otto Ohlendorf, his former superior, to the same fate. Witnesses described a somber, mechanical process. No theatrics, no dramatic final confessions, just the quiet, procedural end of a man who had orchestrated mass death with the same quiet, procedural composure. He was pronounced dead shortly after midnight. 42 years old, he was buried in the prison cemetery at Landsberg, in the same modest plot of earth as Ohlendorf, as Otto Moll from Auschwitz, as others who had once held the power of life and death over thousands, and now shared nothing more than a patch of ground and a number. No monument, no grand epitaph, just an ending as administrative and unremarkable as the crimes that brought him there. So what do we take from the story of Werner Braune? Maybe it's this: the most dangerous men in history aren't always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they're the calm ones, the composed ones, the ones who go home after unspeakable acts and write ordinary letters to their wives. Braune believed until the very end that he had simply done his duty. History disagreed. And in the end, history, not conscience, was the only thing that held him accountable. If this story disturbed you the way it disturbed us researching it, that's exactly the point. These aren't tales meant to entertain, they're warnings, buried in the past, waiting for us not to forget them. If you want to understand how ordinary men become architects of atrocity, subscribe, because next week, we go inside the mind of the man who trained them all.